Veterans Radio. This is Veterans Radio.
Good day. I'm Jim Fausone. I'm the officer of the deck today here on Veterans Radio, and thanks for joining us. We've got some interesting stories for you. We always want to remind you you can find more about Veterans Radio at its Facebook site or at the web, veteransradio.org, where we're on the web 24/7. You can find a lot of our podcasts there as well. We post new ones every Tuesday, so you can get a new story, a new interview, something you didn't know before by going to veteransradio.org. And before we get started, we want to thank our sponsors. First up, we want to thank National Veteran Business Development Council, nvbdc.org. It was established to certify both service-disabled and veteran-owned businesses. You'll find out how they can help your business by going to nvbdc.org. We want to thank Legal Help for Veterans. Legal Help for Veterans fights for veterans' disability rights all across the nation. You can reach them at 800-693-4800 or on the web at legalhelpforveterans.com.
We want to welcome to Veterans Radio a Navy veteran who's got an interesting story to tell, Richard Sherman. Welcome to Veterans Radio.
Jim, thanks for having me on board. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Now, Richard and I met each other down in the Estero, Florida area. Today, I'm up north again where it's 45 degrees, and he just let me know it's 82 degrees where he's at. So he's smarter than the average bear. That's what I want to start with. But
we learn from experience, Jim. We learn from experience.
So how'd you end up in the Navy? Let's start there.
Sure. Yeah, I like most of the families who served, there's those who served before you, right? So my dad was a Korean War Navy veteran, was a machinist mate. His brother was a radioman in World War II, who was a bit older than he was. My godfather on my mom's side, my uncle on my mom's side, was aboard the John F. Kennedy, working the decks of the JFK in the Vietnam era. And so, the military experience was always part of our Thanksgiving and holiday conversations and a lot of teasing and the like. So, for my dad, the Navy was extraordinarily formative for him. He was one of those rough and tumble kids growing up, living on the streets. His parents during the Second World War both worked. And so one worked night work, the other worked day work. And so he spent a lot of time on the street until finally someone said, you better get this straightened out. And he joined the Navy. And to the day he died, my dad's drawers were what we call two-blocked. His T-shirts and underwear and his socks were folded and perfectly kept. And it was really important to my dad. And so I saw that as a young boy and as a young man. And going to college, two of my roommates were ROTC, one in the Air Force, one Army ROTC. And that led me to my senior year of college, where I signed papers to go to officer candidate school in the Navy. And that's where we get started.
Well, it's 1989. You go into the Navy and you stay in various capacities till 1997. Most of that time as a Navy intelligence officer. That's not an oxymoron. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it was a wonderful experience. I enjoyed the Navy greatly. Probably would have stayed active duty for much, much longer, except that chit was not approved by the commander-in-chief, my future wife. So just a joke. But her father,
that's how that works. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, her father was a two-star admiral, so she spent a lot of time, in that experience. And I had varied interests as well. But the Navy intelligence field, it's just a wonderful opportunity for me personally. I was an international relations and economics major in college. Always interested in, the how states and nations work, history, the history of war, the history of peace, the history of diplomacy. And for me, I think the field of intelligence is extraordinarily interesting in the sense that the Navy experience, I can't speak to the Army or the Air Force, but we get exposure to all the different communities, right? We get the surface fleet, we get the subs, we get the aviation. I was at the aviation squadron. I was with the Marines. I was at the Pentagon. You get these special centers of intelligence that you get an opportunity. So as a career, there was lots more opportunity ahead that seemed particularly interesting. And, several of my OCS classmates and Intel school classmates continued on when I returned to the civilian world. But it is exceedingly interesting, right? You get spec ops experience, you get surface, you get subs, it's really cool because you get exposure to the breadth of what the Navy does, and you also have a perspective on what's happening. And I think because of this book, which we're talking about, I'm very acutely aware of those, particularly in World War I and World War II, that had really no idea where they fit into the overall piece of the engagement or the battle. Whereas in the intelligence field, for me anyway, it was very helpful to understand the breadth and the scope of what we were trying to accomplish.
One of the things I'm hearing is that it was intellectually challenging, and that it was because of that scope, you kind of had to be well-rounded, and you had to be curious. Am I getting some of these traits right?
Yeah, I think that's right, Jim. I think lots of different skill sets goes into every MOS, right? I think at the core, if there's one thing that's carried with me, and we'll talk about my life afterwards, but it is I'm very analytical. You have to analyze information, and I will tell the story that as a 22-year-old, I'm floating in the Persian Gulf, and it's Desert Shield. I have my ensign bars on, and I'm just trying to figure out where the head is and what exactly a passageway is. I'm just trying to stay out of the way. And I had a 04 that gave me some opportunity to do briefings, and I was called down to the stateroom of the SEAL team commander, and I walked in the room, and they're dressing in wetsuits. And I said, "Sir, yes, and there's knives out, there's weapons out, and this is Desert Shield, not Desert Storm." And they say to me, I said, "Well, what's up? How can I help?" And they said, "Well, we're going swimming tonight." I said, "Oh, okay." I said, and they asked me some specific questions, and then the thing, kind of hit me in my head. It really became real very real at that stage, because it's important to know what you know, and it's important to know what you don't know, what you're opining about, what your assessment is versus what is fact. And that became very apparent to me, because when you mix opinion with fact, they end up with body bags, right? I mean, it was like a dong went off in my head, like, wake up. And the really interesting thing about it was, after we spoke, they wanted to access to the information that I had shared with them, so that they could read the intelligence reports themselves and also make their own conclusions. And that level of professionalism, very early on in my Navy officer career, was very formative for me. So yeah, I think analytical is very important, and also being able to understand what you know and what you assess or think is going to happen. Those are very different things. I think, if I may step aside, in our modern society, there's a lot of opinion that we read online or that we hear on the news or whatever. That's purely opinion or assessment of fact, and those things are very, very different. And I learned that at 22.
Well, and there's nothing lower on a ship than ensign, who, as you say, I'm just trying to stay out of the way. I just don't want to create a problem. So I've been there, done that. I want to take these traits, and you added analytical to it, because it's going to tie into the book the career that you chose, and the book that we're going to talk about, Never Home. But tell us about that transition. Tell us, okay, the commander-in-chief has said you're not re-upping in the Navy no matter what my admiral dad says. You better come home and do something, Richard. So what does Richard Sherman come home and do?
Whatever she tells me to do. So in January, I'll celebrate 30 years. And so far, that ability to be obedient and follow orders has worked out okay. No,
still an ensign in that ranking.
And on a performance improvement plan for the last 30 years. I'm still doing extra military instruction. But No, but on a serious note, I was in the intelligence field, and I loved that. But I started with an international relations economics background. So while I was in a reservist at the Pentagon, I got my MBA from Georgetown, and then worked on Wall Street for about 16 years as an analyst. As an analyst, right, analyzing numbers and earnings per share and whether management can execute what they say they can execute. And so I did that for 15, 16 years. And um, during that time, I was, working a lot of hours. I think at least once or twice I worked 30 consecutive hours. So it was a lot of hours, and I was getting of a certain age that starting to consider other opportunities. And my wife had purchased me a one-on-one lesson with a photographer. Now, I'd always been interested in photography. It really goes back to the Gulf War. When I left for the Gulf War again, untouched ensign bars on my collars. I went home to see my folks and say goodbye, and I headed out. And I said to my dad, I had a quiet moment with him. I said, Dad, any advice? And he gave me no advice. What he gave me was his digital SLR camera that he had done all of our family photos with, a Minolta film camera. And I took it on board. And fortunately, as an officer on board a helicopter carrier, I had a little bit of space. I could stuff it on. And we did a missile shoot off the coast of the US, off the coast of North Carolina, uh, as part of the preparations for heading over into the Far East or the Middle East. And I remember we did a missile shoot, and I had the camera up, and I was leaning on. I wasn't on duty at the time. I had my camera lined up. It's all manual up against a superstructure, and I have fast film in it, and I have f4, all this other. Anyway, making the camera as fast as possible, and I have the shutter pressed halfway down, just waiting for it to shoot. Because I figured I'll jump like hell, and it's exactly what happened. It shot out and jumped like hell. Geez, I probably can send this to you, Jim, but I have a wonderfully exposed film image when I came home 8 months later, and then waited 2 weeks, of a missile leaving a tube about 20 yards, 30 yards out, with a beautiful plume of smoke, perfectly clear. And at that stage, I learned that, what the camera sees, can see, and can't see is very different than what we see with our own eyes. And so while I'm working a Wall Street job, hours are long. My wife gets me as a present a time with a professional photographer to do some lessons. And he sat down with me at the end. He said, you could do this professionally if you wanted. I'm working a Wall Street job. I'm working that's the last thing from my mind. A couple of years later, I'm worn out. Some things have gone well, some things haven't gone well, and I'm thinking to myself, do I really want to do this? And yeah, so I, at that stage, made the decision. My wife and I don't have children, and she has been a very successful career, and she had the health care covered for that. And I said, how many times would a guy in the mid 40s have an opportunity to do something that they're really passionate about? And that was photography. And so I started this photography business. Started to study at the New York Institute of Photography. I studied photography and videography. Worked with hired professional photographers who are instructors now, to look at my work and then work underneath them, give them images, and they would give me feedback to try to accelerate my learning curve. And yeah, so spent a couple of years kind of learning photography, and getting better at the craft.
And so Richard is a professional photographer now, and that's the journey how he got there. Give folks your website, and then I want to talk about the book.
Okay, well, I have two websites, one for the book, which you can talk about later, but it's richardshermanphotography.com. It's just very simple, richardshermanphotography.com. As a former Navy guy, I do a lot of nautical stuff. I do sailing races. Sometimes I'm out shooting out on a helicopter, and sometimes I'm just on a chase boat. Sometimes I'm just inshore shooting a lot of boats inshore. But I do a lot of nautical stuff and nature stuff. And one of my things that I'm most proud of is there's more than 3 dozen VA medical facilities that have purchased my artwork and installed it in their facilities. And those of us who've been to VA facilities know that a VA is different than a hospital, because our veterans, particularly veterans of a certain age, will spend many hours there. They'll go to the barber shop, or they'll get a cup of coffee, or they'll go to the little candy store, a little store there. They'll pick up a T-shirt, and they'll spend some hours telling, sea stories with their fellow veterans that are there. So to think that maybe my images could be a conversation starter for one of them means a lot to me. It really does.
That's great. Somewhere along the line, and I've heard the story, but I'm going to let you tell it. You thought, I'm going to go photograph American cemeteries overseas, which resulted in becoming the book Never Home, remembering the military heroes who never returned, which is not only photographs but stories. Uh, Tell us about the journey to get that up and out.
Sure. Yeah, we talked about sort of the military background. As veterans, we think about those who went before us, and we never can never really repay them. And we're from our very first days in boot camp or officer candidate school, we're aware of the sacrifices and their valor. And then even now, as we're speaking now, I think for veterans who are listening now, we're also very mindful that there are people on ships, at sea, in the air, or in places even more dangerous right now as we're enjoying 40-degree rainy day in Detroit or an 82-degree sunny day here in Estero, Florida. But we're very aware of that, right? So it was never far from my mind, but really kind of coalesced around I'm working a financial services job and I go to Vancouver, Canada in 2007, and I meet a cab driver. And as you know, Jim, from hearing me speak before, I like to talk to cab drivers. They're usually immigrants from somewhere that make their way to the West, and whether it's the US or in this case, Canada. And I started to chat with the cab driver. It turned out it was a very transformative conversation because he was a World War II vet for the Ukrainian army. So he was a young man at the time fighting for the Russian Red Army with, against the Nazis in front of them, which was, devastating. And then, it was uncertain whether that was more dangerous minute to minute than fighting for the Russian Red Army, they were brutalized, as he explained to me, not every day, but certainly there was instances of great brutality and deprivation that the Russians um, imposed upon their allies, the Ukrainians. We're much more aware of that cultural and ethnic difference today at least than I was in 2007. And so speaking with him, in 20 to 25-minute cab drive between the airport and the hotel, he shared some of his experience as a young man in his teens, being called into combat and his experience. And, a couple things came out of it. The two probably most meaningful stories came out of it. It was that, they were suffering a great deal, the Ukrainian, his friends and mates were dying regularly. And so there wasn't much hope for sure. And then, he explained to me that out of the blue one day, these young men started to appear with short haircuts and well trained and with weapons and the like, and they started to fight next to them, and they were the American troops. Now, there's very, very little written about American experience in the Eastern Front, very, very little. And so I've had an opportunity to meet with somebody recently, a World War II vet that had that experience working on the Eastern Front, but very little is known about that. But he explained to me at that moment things started to change for them. They had a chance, they had hope, whereas before it was a rather dour outlook for them. And he couldn't understand, this man's in his 80s at the time, driving the cab and saying, why would you boys leave the safety of your own home, which is, of course, thousands of miles away, an ocean away, a continent away? Why would you come and fight in our land with us when we didn't even want to be there fighting? And it was a very emotional conversation that we had. And I was obviously very impactful to me, right? Because he was here in front of me sharing the story because of the sacrifices of others that I would never meet, right? And so against that, right, with that story, he shared a second story against the backdrop of war and deprivation and horror, and we know what that's like. The American troops had food every day. They had rations every day. And this was as baffling to him in his 80s as I'm sure as it was as a teenager. He explained they would be fed only every 4 or 5 days by the Russian Red Army. They'd have a bowl of something every 4 to 5 days. Let's call it porridge. I don't know. And yet here the American troops, thousands of miles from home, had their rations. And humanity emerged. The American troops, he explained, would open their rations and share what they had with him and his Ukrainian colleagues. A half of a chocolate bar, a cigarette. It was I get emotional when I realize, against this horror and darkness of war, compassion and brotherhood emerges. And that really had an influence on me. I got out of the cab And I went to get my luggage out of the trunk, and I turned around, and there he was, and with his hand extended, he said, I want to say thank you to America." Humbling, right? Me,
Right, right.
I'm no one. It just, and to shake his hand and accept that. Uh, well, that set off 10 years of telling the story and laying in bed at night thinking about this personal experience of sacrifice and war. Not that the Third Army moved south under Patton, or this
But
was
but
now
the
a person.
but the personal story of leaving a safe home to go fight in a foreign land and then ultimately dying in a foreign land and what happens then.
Right, right, right. And so for me, it became, disturbing that I could never go and thank them. And 2017, I started to work with Mary Virginia Swanson, who is a very well-known photography book consultant. She's been an incredible assistant to me, but she gave me a real jolt of energy when we talked about this, because Mary Virginia is well known, and she worked for Ansel Adams, as you heard me say before, when she was a younger woman. And so that she would lend her name to this project, that she would stand behind this project, meant a lot to me. And so we formulated this plan, and I worked with the American Battle Monuments Commission that manages and maintains 26 overseas military cemeteries, of which 23 pertain to World War I and World War II. And they were extremely supportive, and they were just a wonderful organization to work with. And from that, I launched into 6 years of travel, 4 years of travel. 2 years were lost or gained to COVID. Lost in the sense I couldn't travel, but it allowed me to expand the biographical section in the middle of the book. This is the middle chapter of the book.
And this is a part I think a lot of people won't, haven't thought about, maybe haven't read, haven't seen the history. There are 26 overseas cemeteries, and it's what, 100,000 plus men primarily who never returned home.
Right. I use the term memorialized, but there's over 200,000 of those that are memorialized from World
Uh,
War I and World War II. And the reason I use memorialized is for those of us who served in the Navy or in the Marine Corps or in the Army Air Services, many of them have never and will never be recovered, lost forever.
right.
So just rough numbers, World War II, there's around 93,000 that are buried overseas. And there's about 79,000 that are listed on the walls of the missing, almost a 1-for-1 ratio.
And these cemeteries, who maintains them? Who owns them? Who honors these men who never returned home?
So the American Battle Monuments Commission, which in 2023 celebrated its 100th anniversary, manages all of these cemeteries. They have it's an incredible organization of the US government. They have about 470, 480 employees, of which I think around 400 are foreign nationals. And so these cemeteries technically belong to the countries where they're built, but they are provided to our nation free of charge, in a perpetual lease by the host nations. So they're managed and maintained by the ABMC, which includes mostly foreign nationals that wash the headstones, keep the grass meticulously trimmed. And I always say this, as you know, Jim, I challenge you, go find a cigarette butt in one of them. You'll never find one. Go find a piece of plastic on the ground. You'll never find one. They maintain meticulous care, as they should, as they rightly should, of
And
these final resting places.
and I think most of us have been at national cemeteries in our states that the VA maintains, or we've stopped by or seen film of Arlington National Cemetery, and I think we all walk away amazed at how well kept they are, but how respectful it is, and how much you walk away feeling like this is sacred ground and is treated as sacred ground. And in looking at the photos in the book Never Home, you get that same feeling that this is not only well maintained but really sacred ground. And as you were going around and capturing these photographs and capturing these stories, tell me what you walked away with.
Well, certainly it's a change of your life for sure. Like, so when I speak to folks about going and, oh, I'm going to go to Normandy next year, or I'm going to Florence or wherever, I always say caveat emptor. When you walk in the cemetery, you will be changed, and by the time you walk out, you will feel very differently about this. I feel like, you know, in Europe, the world wars are much more recent than they are in the United States. And maybe that's due to geography. But I'll give you an example. My first cemetery I went to was a World War cemetery, the Somme, up north of Paris, um, on Memorial Day in 2018. I got there early. I had, press credentials, went in, start photographing, getting ready. And then there's a little hill, there's a little town up on the hill, and up when the ceremony was getting ready to begin, all these French folks, 100 years after the end of World War One, in their finest, right? Women in dresses, men in suits, comes like the whole town just kind of empties and comes down to the cemetery, right? So these are very sacred grounds for sure, and our allies keep meticulously care of them. I think what's changed is that it's more recent for me now, right? Sometimes it's because I talked to my uncle, my dad's brother, but it's I was a little kid at
Yeah.
the time. Yeah,
Well, and it changed their lives in Europe without that American presence. But I want to expand this a little bit because I think again, maybe people go, yeah, there are those over in Europe, but kind of surprised to find out that they're in the Philippines and they're elsewhere around the world. Give us some of those other locations that probably aren't top of mind.
yeah. So it took me 6 years and 8 trips to go to 3 continents. Most of them, of course, are in Europe, France, Belgium. General Patton's laid to rest in Luxembourg, the Netherlands, which is incidentally the second most visited cemetery behind, of course, Normandy. And as I say, it really has nothing really to do with the Americans. The Dutch, Robert Etzel's written a book about this, have a tremendous passion for keeping the memories of those who sacrificed so much alive. And all the headstones are adopted there by the Dutch families. Italy, there are 2 in Italy. I think I mentioned Belgium already. England, of course, there's World War One and World War II cemetery in England, where those who were in the sea services or those who died in training accidents are. And then in North Africa, the famed standoff between the Desert Fox and Patton in the desert. And it's one of the 4 cemeteries in North Africa where there are, again, more on the walls of the missing from World War II than there are actually buried there because of the amphibious operations, which we are just beginning to learn, as well as that hostile desert environment where bodies are lost and never to be recovered. So North Africa, and then of course Manila is the largest in terms of those who are memorialized. I mean, it vastly is greater than Normandy. There are over 17,000 individuals headstones that are there, over 17,000. So almost twice as many as Normandy, and then a daunting number of, over 36,000 on the walls of the missing. Now, Manila covers the entirety of the war as opposed to 8 weeks or a 12-week or 4-month campaign. It covers from 41 to, and a big geography, right? I think about, MacArthur flees the Philippines in May of 42. At the very same month that the U.S. Navy records one of its really pivotal victories over the Japanese down in the Battle of Leyte Gulf and stop the progression of the Japanese down into New Guinea and down towards obviously Australia. But Manila covers the entirety of the war, so it's enormous in terms of those memorialized there.
Let me come back to the book Never Home. As you were putting that together, and as I said, it's not only photographs, it's stories, it's interviews with veterans, with people with deep connections to the cemeteries. Who's your audience, and where do you want this book to end up? Let's talk about how people can buy it and kind of what you think they'll get out of it.
Okay, yeah. I mean, the audience is anyone who will stop and listen. In this, so there's obviously those of a certain age that have served in Vietnam or Korea or World War II, and now even the Gulf War. The veteran community obviously is a big part of that. I think certainly veterans over 50. Something changes. I think that love of that experience and our brothers strengthens. I think after 50. So certainly that's a key. I hate to use the term commercial audience, but a key audience that buys the book. On the other side, there's an audience that really doesn't buy the book that I'm very passionate about. It's these young people, right? I've done high schools, I've done universities. The idea is that they consume information. They learn more visually than through reading than we did as young men and women, right? They want to see a video. They want to look at books. They want or pictures. They want to look at I don't know short clips of things. And so my hope is that I can have a beneficial impact on them because for them, they've not talked. They didn't have an uncle who was in World War II. Maybe it was a great uncle or a great great uncle, right? They didn't have anyone that they really knew, and so it's distant for them. It's almost like just over the horizon for them to relate to. It could be the Middle Ages. It could be, the time of the New Testament. I mean, it's just in this nebulous pocket of ancient history, which is really not. And so to have that opportunity to share these images with them and the stories of those who were killed that were 19, 20, 24, 26 years old, 28 years old, that they can relate to. It's my hope that that has the biggest impact. That audience has the book has the biggest impact on that audience, on that demographic.
I see the book and the photographs in the book as sort of a key that hopefully unlocks some curiosity where they go, I didn't know about that. That's interesting. I want to learn more. And that photograph may unlock them to go, whether it's search on the web or go to the library and say, I want to know more about this cemetery, the folks who fought there and died. So
Right.
I really think that's the sort of long-term value, Richard Sherman. Uh, and if folks want the book, tell us there's a website for the book. Tell us about that.
Sure. I'll digress before I get that if we have a minute, Jim. They say if you want to meet an American college student, go to Florence, right? Because they all study abroad at Florence. It's 20 minutes to the American cemetery in Florence. Whereas if you're in Paris, it's 3+ hours to get out to Normandy. Your heart and your soul will be changed as in Florence as it is in Normandy, right? So I would wish that there would be a way to insert it in that everyone who studies abroad takes that 20-minute ride, all those young folks. The project has a home page, neverhomeheroes.com, and there's a link to buy the book, and I ship you the book. The book sells for $29.50. I'm very proud to keep it as low a price as possible. It wasn't about making the New York Times bestseller list or making money on it because we're a long way from recuperating. This was a self-funded project. It took 6 years and 8 trips to travel around the world to do this. But I wanted to keep it accessible because this is about, I have a duty to those. They become like brothers and sisters to me. There's, by the way, 6 nurses and females in there, many of which that were killed before or served before American forces arrived into Europe or into World War II or even World War One in certain cases. So neverhomeheroes.com, and you can buy the book there. The other thing I'm very proud of is we printed this book in the United States. It was much cheaper to be able to print it in Korea or China, but it was my decision that this had to be printed in the United States. And Warzala Sheridan up in Wisconsin did a fine job in printing the book, and I'm really proud to have worked with them and very grateful for their work.
So let me bring this full circle because at the outset I indicated you had certain qualities: intellectual curiosity, being well-rounded, curious. And you added in analytical, and you can see how all those traits, veteran radio listeners, Richard Sherman has brought to this project. And we highly recommend go to the website, buy the book. Leave it out so maybe it will be the key that unlocks curiosity for somebody else to go, I didn't know that what went on in the Philippines or what went on at Florence that this is there. So we'd encourage you to do that. If you got a couple more minutes, I want to ask you a question because I happen to know a Marine who has just been appointed the ambassador to Tunisia. I know about the North Africa conflict, but I didn't know anything about the Tunisian cemetery. Tell me a little bit about that, so next time when I see him, I can regale him with what you know.
Very good. Yeah, so it's right there in Tunis, Tunisia. right fast along the shores of the Mediterranean, on the southern coast of the Mediterranean. There are some 2,700, a little over 2,700 headstones there. It's a beautiful cemetery. It's one of our smaller cemeteries, 27 acres, just over 27 acres. There's 1,000 more listed on the walls of the missing. Has beautiful, peaceful fountains that run through it. You can see in the picture in the book, you can see a mosque in the background. It's a wonderful final resting place for those who served in that campaign. And of course, the North African campaign was a lot of things. I'll try to keep it short. Three things. One, deserts are not really easy places to hold land. It's easy to take land, but it's very difficult to hold land. And so before our arrival, the American arrival and the massive force that we brought, starting in Morocco, Algeria, Tunis, and eventually getting to the east to help our British allies in Egypt, it was a bit of a soccer pitch, right? The sides were changed very, very quickly, and what was left was a lot of war dead and casualties from that experience. So it's a hard place to hold territory. And of course, point number two is the British were adamant and the French, because we needed the oil to come out of the Middle East up through the Suez to continue to help with the war effort. There's an old saying Jim, you've heard me say in the military, is that firepower wins battles, but logistics wins wars, right? And so the British in Egypt endured quite a beating and quite a difficult time there. And the third thing I'll say is that there are very interesting headstones there of those who have served. For example, there are those who served in a water battalion that are buried there. Just logistics, like just providing water so people don't die of thirst at the front, or it was an important piece of logistics. And Floyd Draper is buried there. Now, Floyd Draper is one of the two Olympians that are in my book. Floyd Draper won the Olympic gold medal in 1936 in front of Adolf Hitler, running the 4x100 relay with Jesse Owens. He went on to become an A-20 Bravo Havoc pilot. And in the Battle of Kasserine Pass, his plane either went down to mechanical error or shot down. It's not exactly certain, but his plane went down and he was killed on January 4th, 1943. So here we have, a hero in many fronts. By today's standards, most of our heroes are athletes. So he was an incredible athlete, won the NCAA championship in the sprint, in the 100 and 200, I believe. But anyway, he was an NCAA champion in sprinting, and here he went on to serve his nation, and unfortunately never made it home. And he's there, as well as several Native Americans that are there. We have 4 cemeteries, including Tunis, Tunisia, that have Native Americans that were killed in service to their nation.
Well, I look forward to talking with Ambassador Bazzi and dropping a few of these facts and making sure and as a Marine, I'm sure he will appropriately honor the 2,700 who are there and the 1,000 on the wall of the missing. Richard Sherman, thank you for taking some time today. I'm glad we got the connection all sorted out. But thank you for taking time to talk to Veterans Radio on the book and your experiences in putting together Never Home.
Jim, thanks to you and Veterans Radio. I mean, we need this in our society today, this connection, this important connection that we have. We need community in a world that's really kind of built around transaction. It's great to be part of your community, and thank you for having me on today.
And I want to thank everybody for listening to Veterans Radio today. I am Jim Fausone. It's been a pleasure to be your host. I'm a veterans disability lawyer at Legal Help for Veterans, and you can reach us at 800-693-4800 or legalhelpforveterans.com on the web. You can follow Veterans Radio on Facebook and listen to its podcasts and internet radio shows by visiting us at veteransradio.org. That's veteransradio.org. We again want to thank our national sponsors, the National Veterans Business Development Council, nvbdc.org. Legal Help for Veterans, a veterans disability law firm with a national practice before the VA, can help you on your claims and your appeals. It can be reached at legalhelpforveterans.com or 1-800-693-4800. We also want to thank our local sponsors. This would include the Charles S. Kettles chapter of the Vietnam Veterans of America, that's chapter 310, VFW Graf O'Hara Post 423, the American Legion Irwin Preskin Post 46 in Ann Arbor as well, the VA Ann Arbor Healthcare System, and certainly the National Vietnam Veterans of America Association. You can be a sponsor by going to veteransradio.org, clicking on the About Us and our sponsors, and help us out. Keep this program alive for the 21 and 22 years. Keep us going for another 20. Thank you.